The year is 1945. The war that had consumed the world for 6 devastating years has finally ended, and Japan, once an empire that stretched across the Pacific, now lies in ruins. The streets of Tokyo and Yokohama are filled with debris, broken buildings, and a silence so heavy it feels like the weight of history itself pressing down on every soul. And into this shattered landscape march the victors, tall, foreign soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms, speaking a language that sounds like nothing the Japanese people have ever heard. The women of Japan, who had been told for years that these men were demons, monsters who would show no mercy, now stand behind their paper windows and watch with hearts pounding in their chests. What they are about to witness will challenge everything they believed, everything they feared, and everything they thought they knew about their enemies. Before we dive into this extraordinary moment in history, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this incredible story of humanity emerging from the ashes of war. This isn't just another historical account of military occupation. This is the story of the moment when fear met compassion, when propaganda collided with reality, and when two peoples who had been taught to hate each other discovered something unexpected in the rubble of a devastated nation: the possibility of understanding. What happened in those first days and weeks when British Commonwealth forces arrived in Japan would defy every expectation, challenge every assumption, and reveal truths about human nature that transcend nationality, language, and even the horrors of war itself. The images that Japanese women saw in their streets weren't the ones they had been prepared for. The behavior they witnessed wasn't what their government had warned them about. And the connections that would slowly, carefully begin to form would prove that even in the darkest aftermath of conflict, there exists within humanity a capacity for grace that can bridge seemingly impossible divides. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackles through radio speakers across Japan, announcing the unthinkable: surrender. For a nation that had never known defeat, that had been raised on the mythology of invincibility and divine protection, the words shatter reality itself. Women across Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, and countless smaller cities and villages hear the trembling voice of their God Emperor admitting what had been whispered in frightened tones but never spoken aloud: Japan has lost the war. In the days that follow, a strange quiet settles over the ruins. The propaganda machine that had churned for years suddenly falls silent. The promises of victory, the assurances that the enemy would never set foot on sacred Japanese soil, the threats of what would happen if they did, all of it now exposed as the desperate rhetoric of a dying regime. Mothers who had sent their sons to war, wives who had waved goodbye to husbands never to return, daughters who had worked in factories making weapons for a cause now lost. They all wait in a suspended state between grief and terror, wondering what comes next. The warnings had been clear and terrifying. Government officials, military leaders, and propaganda broadcasts had spent months preparing the Japanese population for what they claimed would be an invasion of barbaric proportions. American and British soldiers, they were told, were savage beasts who would show no mercy to a defeated people. Women specifically were warned to hide, to flee to the mountains, to take their own lives rather than face the certain horror that occupation would bring. Stories circulated of atrocities, of mass violence, of a vengeful enemy that would exact brutal punishment for every Japanese soldier who had fought, every bomb that had been dropped, every life that had been taken in the long years of Pacific warfare. These weren't mere suggestions. In many communities, women were given practical instructions on how to commit suicide, how to kill their children first to spare them the worse fate that supposedly awaited. The fear was manufactured, weaponized, used as a final tool of control by a government that had already taken so much from its people. September 2, 1945. Aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the formal surrender documents are signed. General Douglas MacArthur accepts Japan's unconditional surrender on behalf of the Allied powers. Among those present are representatives of the British Commonwealth, soldiers who had fought in Burma, in Singapore, in the desperate battles across Southeast Asia, where Japanese and British forces had clashed with devastating ferocity. These men have their own memories of war, their own losses, their own reasons to harbor deep resentment. They have seen the aftermath of the Burma Railway, the fall of Singapore, the treatment of prisoners of war. They have every justification by the brutal logic of conflict to arrive in Japan seeking some form of retribution. But the orders they receive are different. The British Commonwealth Occupation Force, soon to be deployed to the Chugoku region and parts of the Kanto area, is given explicit instructions, discipline, restraint, and the careful rebuilding of a shattered nation. The mission isn't revenge, it's something far more complex and, in many ways, far more challenging. Late September and early October 1945. The first British troops begin arriving in Yokohama and gradually move into their assigned regions. The Japanese people, particularly the women who remain in the cities, the men are mostly dead, imprisoned, or scattered. Watch from whatever shelter they can find. Windows with paper screens become observation posts. Doorways become vantage points. The women clutch children close, their hearts racing with that particular fear that comes from helplessness, from having no choice but to wait and see what fate has delivered to their streets. And then they see them. The British soldiers. Tall men in khaki uniforms, moving in organized units through streets still filled with rubble. Their skin is different shades, some pale and sunburned, others darker. Soldiers from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, India, representing the vast diversity of the Commonwealth. They carry rifles, but the weapons are slung over shoulders, not pointed at civilians. They march with military precision, but there's something in their posture that doesn't match the propaganda descriptions. They don't swagger with cruelty. They don't leer at windows or kick down doors. They walk carefully, almost tentatively, through this foreign landscape of destruction. Yuki Tanaka, a young mother of 2 in Yokohama, would later describe that first morning when British soldiers appeared on her street. She had spent the previous night preparing for the worst, holding her children and whispering prayers to ancestors, contemplating the small knife she had hidden, should the propaganda prove true. She heard the sound of boots on broken pavement, the unfamiliar cadence of English being spoken, the commands being given in that sharp, clipped accent so different from American English. She peered through a crack in her damaged wall, her hands shaking, expecting to see the monsters she had been warned about. Instead, she saw young men, some barely older than boys, looking around with expressions that seemed less like conquerors and more like visitors uncertain of their welcome. One soldier, a tall man with red hair that seemed impossible to her, she had never seen such a color on a human head, caught sight of a group of children peeking from behind a partially collapsed building. Instead of shouting or advancing threateningly, he stopped, slowly reached into his pack and pulled out what looked like wrapped candy. He set it on a clean piece of rubble, stepped back and gestured for the children to take it. Then he and his unit moved on, not waiting for thanks, not demanding interaction. The children, after long minutes of hesitation, crept forward and discovered chocolate. Real chocolate, something most of them had never tasted. This scene, or variations of it, repeated across occupied areas in those first crucial days. The British soldiers had been briefed extensively on Japanese culture, on the importance of avoiding actions that would deepen humiliation or provoke desperation. They understood, at least intellectually, that the civilians they now encountered were traumatized, grieving, and terrified. The military leadership of the Commonwealth forces, particularly officers who had studied Japan before the war, or who had experience in colonial administration, emphasized a policy that modern observers might call winning hearts and minds. Though that phrase wouldn't be coined for another decade, the soldiers were instructed to be firm but fair, to maintain discipline not just among themselves, but in their interactions with the occupied population, to avoid the kind of behavior that would confirm the worst fears planted by Japanese propaganda. It was, in essence, an experiment in occupation as humanitarian mission rather than punitive exercise. But this wasn't universally easy or simple. Among the British ranks were men who had suffered terribly at Japanese hands, former prisoners of war, soldiers who had watched comrades die in brutal conditions, men who carried deep psychological and physical scars from years of savage jungle warfare. For them, walking through Japanese streets with orders to be compassionate required extraordinary discipline. There were incidents, isolated cases where resentment boiled over, where the temptation for personal revenge proved too strong. But these were remarkably exceptions rather than the rule. The military justice system dealt swiftly with soldiers who violated the conduct codes, sending a clear message that the occupation would be governed by law and order, not mob justice or individual vengeance. This consistency, this visible restraint, began to register with the watching Japanese population. The message was subtle but powerful. These foreign soldiers were bound by rules that they actually followed, even when no one would have blamed them for doing otherwise. Michiko Nakamura, a widow whose husband had died at Okinawa, lived in a small neighborhood in western Tokyo where British soldiers were billeted in a school building that had survived the bombings. She was among the women assigned to work in the kitchens preparing food for the occupation forces, a job that filled her with dread and shame, serving the men whose comrades had killed her husband. On her first day, she kept her eyes down, moved mechanically through tasks, and waited for the harassment or abuse she assumed was inevitable. Instead, she encountered a British sergeant who spoke a few words of Japanese, clearly learned from a phrasebook, who thanked her for the work with awkward formality, and who noticed when she struggled with a heavy pot and quietly asked another soldier to help without making her feel incompetent. Over the following weeks, she observed these men closely. The way they joked with each other but stopped their roughhousing if Japanese civilians were nearby. The way they shared their rations with local children who lingered near the building. The way they organized medical clinics where British doctors would treat Japanese civilians for free, asking nothing in return. None of this matched the narrative she had been fed. None of it aligned with her image of the enemy. And this cognitive dissonance, this collision between expectation and reality, created a crack in the wall of hatred that war had built. The curiosity began to flow both ways. British soldiers, for their part, had carried their own propaganda images of the Japanese, fanatical warriors without humanity, a people so alien that understanding them was impossible. What they found in the rubble of Japanese cities challenged those assumptions just as profoundly. They discovered a population that valued dignity even in defeat. Mothers who protected their children with fierce devotion, elderly people who maintained ceremonial courtesies even while living in makeshift shelters, young women who worked with quiet determination to rebuild some semblance of normal life. The soldiers noticed the meticulous way Japanese families would clean the small spaces they occupied, the care taken with simple meals, the gentle interactions between generations. They saw humanity in its most essential form, people trying to survive, to maintain some thread of meaning and connection in the aftermath of catastrophe. And this recognition, this ability to see the defeated enemy as fellow human beings rather than abstract representatives of an evil empire, created its own transformation. Language became the first bridge, however fragile. British soldiers began picking up Japanese phrases beyond the basic commands they needed for occupation duties. Some carried dictionaries, practicing pronunciation with almost comical results that sometimes made Japanese children giggle, breaking tension in a way that speeches and official policies never could. Japanese women, particularly those who worked in proximity to the occupation forces, began learning English words and phrases. These linguistic exchanges were tentative at first, fraught with the awkwardness of people who have every reason to mistrust each other but who are finding practical necessity slowly overriding ideological barriers. A soldier might learn to say "arigato gozaimasu" with genuine gratitude when a Japanese laundry worker returned his cleaned uniform. A Japanese woman might learn to say thank you or good morning to the soldiers she passed on her way to work. These tiny transactions of civility accumulated, creating a foundation of normalcy that seemed impossible in those first frightened days of occupation. One story that circulated through Tokyo, told and retold until it took on almost mythical quality, involved a British corporal named Thomas Henderson and an elderly Japanese woman whose name has been lost to history but whose impact resonates in the telling. Henderson's unit was clearing rubble from a street when they discovered the woman trapped in the collapsed lower floor of what had been her home. She had been there for days, surviving on rainwater, certain she would die. Henderson, despite having no rescue training, worked for hours to carefully remove debris, speaking to her constantly in English even though she couldn't understand his words, his tone conveying reassurance and determination. When he finally pulled her free, she was dehydrated and injured but alive. He carried her to a British medical station, stayed with her while doctors worked, and in the following days visited to check on her. Recovery. The woman, once ambulatory again, began appearing at Henderson's unit with small gifts. Origami cranes, a handkerchief she had embroidered, tiny offerings of gratitude that far exceeded their material value. The soldiers in Henderson's unit were moved by this, and word spread. Here was a microcosm of what was possible. A former enemy saving a life not because he was ordered to, but because humanity demanded it, and receiving in return not resentment for her nation's defeat, but gratitude for individual compassion. But the transformation wasn't occurring in isolation or without friction. There were elements within both populations that resisted this thawing of hostilities. Some Japanese, particularly those tied to the old military establishment or who had lost too much to forgive, viewed any cooperation with occupation forces as betrayal. Women who worked for the British or who were seen speaking with soldiers faced social stigma, whispered accusations of being collaborators or, worse, The shame culture that runs deep in Japanese society created its own pressures. Maintaining the proper distance from the occupiers was seen as preserving dignity in defeat. Similarly, among British forces, there were those who viewed fraternization with skepticism or outright hostility. They argued that being too friendly with the Japanese population was dishonoring the memory of those who had died fighting them. That the enemy should be kept at arm's length regardless of their current civilian status. These tensions existed as undercurrents, complicating the narrative, reminding everyone that healing from war is never simple or linear. Yet something remarkable continued to emerge through these complications. British military authorities, recognizing the strategic importance of a stable, cooperative occupation, began implementing programs designed to demonstrate that the Allied presence was about reconstruction, not destruction. They organized food distribution programs in areas suffering acute shortages. They provided medical supplies and set up vaccination clinics as disease threatened to sweep through undernourished populations. They employed Japanese workers in reconstruction projects, paying fair wages that helped families survive the immediate post-war economic collapse. These weren't acts of pure altruism. There was clear strategic calculation in preventing chaos and suffering that could destabilize the occupation. But the effect on the Japanese people, particularly women who were often the primary recipients and distributors of this aid within their communities, was profound. They were experiencing occupation not as the apocalyptic nightmare they had been promised, but as something far more complex, a mixture of control and care, authority and assistance. Keiko Yamamoto, who was 17 in 1945, later wrote in her memoirs about the day she first spoke directly to a British soldier. She had been scavenging for firewood in an area near where a Commonwealth unit was based. An Australian private, noticing her struggle to carry a large bundle of wood, approached and offered to help. Every instinct told Keiko to run, to avoid interaction, to maintain the protective distance she had been taught. But she was exhausted. The wood was heavy, and something in the soldier's gesture seemed genuinely kind rather than threatening. He carried the wood to near her home, set it down carefully, tipped his hat, a gesture that seemed quaintly foreign to her, and walked away without asking for anything in return. Keiko stood there, confused, and moved in equal measure. That evening she told her mother what had happened. Her mother's response was telling. First fear that her daughter had been in danger, then relief that nothing bad had occurred, and finally a quiet admission that perhaps not everything they had been told about the enemy was true. It was this last observation, whispered between mother and daughter in the privacy of their damaged home, that represented the real revolution occurring across Japan. The personal, private acknowledgement that propaganda and reality were not the same thing. The cultural exchanges began to deepen as weeks turned into months. British soldiers discovered Japanese arts that fascinated them. The precision of calligraphy, the meditative quality of tea ceremony, the intricate beauty of traditional textiles. Some soldiers, particularly those from artistic or academic backgrounds, sought out Japanese teachers willing to share these traditions. Japanese civilians, in turn, were exposed to aspects of Western culture that had been filtered through wartime censorship and distortion. Music became a particularly powerful medium of exchange. British and Australian soldiers organized concerts, playing everything from military bands to jazz to classical pieces. Japanese audiences, starved for entertainment and beauty in the midst of ruins, attended these performances and found themselves moved by the universal language of music. Some Japanese musicians, tentatively at first, began playing their own traditional instruments in informal sessions, sharing the haunting sounds of the shakuhachi or the delicate notes of the koto with foreign audiences who listened with unexpected reverence. There was a particular incident in Hiroshima where British Commonwealth forces had a supporting presence that captured the complexity of this evolving relationship. A British medical officer, Captain James Whitmore, volunteered to work in civilian hospitals treating victims of the atomic bombing. Whitmore had lost a brother in Burma to Japanese forces, and his decision to provide medical care to the very population his brother had been fighting represented a profound personal choice. He worked alongside Japanese doctors who initially viewed him with suspicion and resentment. Here was the enemy, offering help in the aftermath of a weapon that had incinerated their city. But Whitmore's skill, his tireless dedication, and most importantly, his visible grief and horror at what he witnessed in the burn wards slowly broke down those barriers. Japanese nurses who worked with him observed that he wept when patients died, particularly children. He learned Japanese medical terminology to communicate more effectively. He shared techniques and medications from Western medicine while showing genuine respect for Japanese medical knowledge. One Japanese doctor, Dr. Takashi Nagai, later wrote that Whitmore's presence taught him something profound, that healing transcends nationality, that the physician's duty to alleviate suffering doesn't pause for political convenience, and that sometimes the most powerful resistance to war's dehumanizing effects is the simple, stubborn insistence on treating former enemies as fellow human beings deserving of care. As 1946 unfolded, the nature of the occupation continued evolving. The initial military rigidity began giving way to more organic cultural coexistence. British soldiers, many of whom would be stationed in Japan for months or years, began forming genuine friendships with Japanese civilians. Language skills improved on both sides. Japanese children, resilient and adaptable as children everywhere, were among the first to fully embrace the new reality. They played games with soldiers, learned English songs, brought their fathers or brothers military medals to show these former adversaries, creating moments of shared military culture that transcended the battlefield's divisions. The soldiers, many far from their own families, found themselves acting as surrogate uncles or older brothers to Japanese children who had lost male relatives to the war. These relationships, formed in the informal spaces between official occupation policy and civilian life, represented grassroots reconciliation that no government could have engineered. But perhaps the most profound transformations occurred in the realm of perception and self-reflection. Japanese women, who had been told their entire lives that their value lay in service and submission to the masculine warrior culture, observed British soldiers who treated women differently, not as property or secondary citizens, but as individuals deserving of basic respect and courtesy. This wasn't universal or perfect. The occupation certainly had its incidents of exploitation and abuse, but the general policy of treating Japanese civilians, including women, with legal protections and social dignity presented an alternative model that some Japanese women found revelatory. Simultaneously, British soldiers who had entered Japan with hardened wartime attitudes found those certainties eroding in the face of daily human contact. It's difficult to maintain abstract hatred for an enemy when that enemy has a name, a face, a family, a story. The soldier who learns that the woman who washes his clothes lost her husband at Guadalcanal, that she has 2 children to feed and an elderly parent to care for, that she rises before dawn and works until she can barely stand. That soldier finds his worldview challenged in ways that no briefing or propaganda could achieve. The redemption in this story isn't simple or complete. This isn't a tale where everyone learned to love each other, and all sins were forgiven in a wash of sentimental reconciliation. Wars leave scars that generations cannot fully heal. Individuals on both sides carried grievances, losses, and trauma to their graves. The structural violence of occupation, however benign its particular manifestation, still represented foreign military control over a sovereign nation. Japanese nationalism, temporarily defeated, would resurface in complex ways in subsequent decades. British imperial attitudes, however modified by this experience, remained rooted in assumptions of cultural superiority that would take much longer to fully interrogate. The story is messy, incomplete, and morally complex, as all true human stories are.